Chers auditeurs,
Dear listeners,
bonjour.
welcome to Comme d'Archi Podcast Season 7.
Saison 7, dans le monde fascinant des architectes.
And in the architectural projects.
Je suis Anne-Charlotte Deponte, passionnée d'architecture et docteur des universités en histoire de l'archi.
I am one of the spokespersons of Anne-Charlotte, who is a PhD in architecture history.
Merci
Thank you
d'être avec moi aujourd'hui.
to be with us today.
Et
And
maintenant,
now,
lundi en français, place au talent.
and Wednesday, let's talk projects. In English, of course.
Bienvenue dans Comme d'Archi.
Dear listeners, we're delighted to be with you today in the company of Maël de Quelen. Hello Maël.
Hello, Anne-Charlotte.
Welcome to Comme d'Archi. You are the chief architect of historic monuments and head of an agency that bears your name, an agency headquartered in Paris. As an appetizer, an unusual question about the architect's taste. Do you enjoy the pleasures of fine dining? What are your favorite dishes? And could you share a memorable taste experience?
Oh. Yes, I enjoy the culinary arts. Absolutely. I have very varied tastes. I like them a lot. Eggs omelette. Yes, that's something I really like a lot, actually. It's really quite simple. And here's the grilled octopus. Well, I have pretty eclectic taste.
Well, maybe a memory to share.
A butternut squash cut into 4, roasted in the oven with a drizzle of olive oil and a pinch of Guérande salt. And 45 minutes later, it's an absolute treat. Well, it's simple.
Right. But that's great. Now, let's talk about your career and how it began. What was that journey and what inspired you to follow this path in architecture? What was your childhood like? Where did your passion for architecture take root? And what studies did you pursue?
My work is, above all, a passion. And this passion really emerged very early on. In fact, maybe when I was 9 or 10 years old. So I am the chief architect for historic monuments. I restore monuments. And this passion started very early, mostly from, well, the trips and visits I used to take with my parents all over France, out in the countryside. And so that discovery of historic monuments, their diversity, their beauty, and the dreams they sparked in me. It was about living there, being able to imagine lives inside those walls. And very early on, I realized that those monuments weren't just frozen in time, relics from the past, witnesses to history, but above all, they were fragile. And it actually took very little time, and very little for an important monument, one that's beautiful, rich, and well-made, to fall into ruin or even be torn down. And that fragility is, well, an awareness. Well, I became aware of it pretty early on, and pretty quickly, too. I quickly decided to actually do something for them.
Yeah, you took part in youth work camps.
So I had to wait until I was 16, because before 16, you just can't. But yeah, restoration camp, you take part in those, or other things like masonry, stone carving, plastering. I started doing that when I was 16, and I realized very early on, well, pretty quickly, that to restore historic monuments, you need, in any case, to take care of them. Well, the best way, in the big gateway, was through architecture. Become an architect, then go on to be a heritage architect, and maybe even a chief heritage architect, to work directly on them, to really be hands-on. So once I had my diploma in hand, I ended up doing all sorts of things other than restoring historic monuments. In fact, quite the opposite. I had the pleasure of learning about architecture, design, and project planning. But when I left there, the passion was still there. And it took me by the hand. And after about 1 or 2 years of practice with a historic monuments architect at the Chaillot School. So the Chaillot School, which lets you earn the diploma in 2 years. Well, Anyway, the heritage architect title is one way to get it. Yeah.
So then you joined an agency in Paris?
Yes.
So 2 years, right? Or not?
Yes, that's right. 2 years with a chief architect of historic monuments in Paris, then 6 years with another chief architect. So I can name them, right? Thierry Algrain, then Lionel Dubois, and then another chief heritage architect working with Benjamin Mouton in Versailles, where I stayed for 3 years before moving on to something else. But it was really with them, with my peers, that I had the joy of rolling up my sleeves and really diving in, working on sites and projects, and really discovering the diversity we have in this profession.
So one of my recurring questions on Comme d'Archi is, do you feel today that you've achieved what you imagined when you graduated?
It really was my dream. I'm grateful I got to make it happen. Yes, completely by really having the reins in my own hands. Obviously, it's connected to an entire profession with so many people who are very active and involved in our heritage field. But yeah, I'm really active. On the other hand, what I hadn't imagined was being in charge of an agency, a team, having employees or rather collaborators. That I had never imagined at all. But of course, it comes with the territory, and it's fantastic. I enjoy it.
So in the end, it works.
Yeah, and it's really a team I'm very fond of. We work really, really well together, yeah.
Yeah, you're already a well-established team.
We are.
Between 12 and 15 right now, and it has been when your agency was under your own name.
In 2013, it was really just a tiny embryonic start, part-time, But in 2015, that was the real start on my own at first, and then from there...
But what was the trigger for creating this?
Actually, after my first experiences with the chief architects of historic monuments, I went on to spend 5 years at the Senate. So, in the Department of Architecture and Buildings with Damien de Schletz, chief architect. And there, it was a completely different way of practicing the profession, really interesting in an occupied site. Well, I don't know, working with members of parliament, but I think I was maybe drifting a bit too far from the real hands-on side of the work I was trained for. And I felt like going back, actually. So the turning point was simply a moment in my life. Should I keep going down this path, or should I do something else? And I chose that other path, going back to my original passion and striking out on my own. And then other things.
So how do you get commissions? Because yeah.
It's tricky at first. So 1 or 2 private commissions, a confidential mural, well, a small one, actually small, but it gives you confidence and helps you get started. And that's something we're always very grateful for. And above all, respond to a lot of calls for bids so you can win a few and really target them and have the chance to work on monuments, important ones, and projects that then lead to more visibility, which helps you grow in experience and skills and lets you showcase more for the next bid. But it takes several years. Is that a long time? Yeah, it's long. A bit long.
All right. So now, could you tell us the story of your projects? What would you say are your most iconic or recent projects? Anything current? And then afterwards, we'll also get into the project, I think, and from there into a whole series of questions where we'll bring out your role as chief architect of historic monument. How do you approach work on civil and religious buildings? There are differences. All right, I won't say any more, otherwise we won't remember all the questions. But anyway, first off, if you want to dive into the projects that matter most to you, the ones you'd like to talk about today?
The projects that are close to my heart. There are a lot of them. It's hard to choose, but honestly, what's really interesting is having projects of different scales and types. So I have a lot of affection and a real attachment to restoration projects. Mostly churches, actually village churches listed as a historic monument. I love restoring churches. There are usually quite a lot of them. They're often, even if we take a little care of them, still pretty much forgotten, in a very, very poor state of preservation, with roofs full of holes and so on. And it's true that this is really the foundation for me, because it's also what I first learned to love and to do, you know. We're usually completely integrated, welcomed by a municipal team of people who live there and really care about their community. So these are restoration projects that are interesting and, on a human level, really very endearing. Then there are other projects that are much more complex and interesting. I really enjoy working on master plan projects, and a master plan, for example. So I've done a few of those. For example, the Château de Chambord, the Luxembourg Palace, and the Bardo Palace in Tunis. Also, the Parliament of the Representatives of the Tunisian people, and the Château de la Selle, Saint-Cloud. And right now, at the Château de Chambord. And these are projects that give project owners, property owners, really an extremely thorough assessment, and complex, truly exhaustive, when it comes to their monuments or their site. From the standpoint of historical and architectural knowledge, the current state of preservation, and also what are the various needs of a site and a monument in terms of showcasing their use, and of course, restoring and highlighting. And all those analyses, well, come together in a proposed restoration program, and for modernization and enhancement and so on, which then serves as a solid roadmap for the next 15 years. That's something I really enjoy doing too, but that's more of a project, actually, yeah.
Right. So you even handle the planning?
Yes.
Yeah. For example, with Chambord, do we have any idea of the timeline? Maybe we shouldn't talk about it because sometimes the schedule can be a bit uncertain. But about this design approach.
Yeah. So whether it's Chambord or Chaumont or somewhere else, these are fairly short time frames, right? About a year, well, between a year and a half, 12 to 18 months. We don't need to spend too much time. In the end, you have to take the time. The bigger the estate, the more you need to take an interest in it and get involved. But in terms of timing, anyway, the real point is to untangle things so decision makers can find a way, well, at least to make their choices.
Exactly, making choices and planning with a priority order that truly serves
the monument, the site, and also the goals of a site manager. But when it comes to projects, anyway, there's so many fascinating things. And maybe, I can give some examples. There's no shortage of them.
So then, what exactly does it mean to be the chief architect of historic monuments when you're working on heritage? Actually, there's a whole set of regulations in place. An ordinary architect will, generally speaking, sometimes not be involved. But really, you're the one holding the reins. I mean, it's your qualifications, your expertise.
Yes, yeah, exactly. For historic monuments that belong to the state, absolutely. So to work on a historic monument that's classified or listed, you really do need proper training and the right skills to work on them. When a monument is classified, you need to be an architect and have the training that qualifies you as a heritage architect. You also need to have, at the very least, 10 years of experience in this field under your belt to be able to step in. Now, what makes chief architects of historic monuments special is that they've passed the competitive exam that grants them that title. And that title allows you to, to be for a certain number of, one or several geographic areas, which are basically counties. Most of the time, these are geographic districts that are counties or else estates, large estates. For example, these are mainly cathedrals, or castles that belong to the state. It could also be works of civil engineering, like an aqueduct, for example, in the district you're responsible for, or a large estate in those districts. Well, the chief architect of historic monuments is called in for all project management work, for restoration or development. But they're also called in when there's an incident, for example, with a monument that doesn't necessarily belong to the state but collapses or catches fire. But it's listed in a district he's responsible for, for emergency work at least. We call on him or get his approval.
So you were talking about your love, you could say. Church? Anyway, among other things. Castles too? Yes. In the end, when you approach this kind of heritage with that sense of responsibility, really, I guess you kind of take on a reverent mindset, whether it's a castle or a church, you soak it in.
Absolutely. Yes. Oh, yes. Exactly. Whether it's for religious building or a castle, a mansion, or a national palace. First of all, we get down to it. In the end, you just feel really small and quite humble and lucky, especially to be able to work on monuments like these, which have come down to us in relatively good condition. And we have this duty and this responsibility, this need to pass it on to future generations in a condition at least as good, if not better. So first off, that's really the very first thing to consider. Then, exactly, getting a bit on the same level as the monument. I mean, it's about understanding it, first and foremost, really understanding it. That's right. It always involves a historical study, a documentary study, an archival study, and also a comparative study, And this castle that we're going to restore. First off, try to understand what makes it beautiful, why it was given protected status, and what makes it unique. What am I going to identify today as important and crucial to preserve so as not to betray it and to keep it in the presentation that will best honor it, so to speak. So, this is really, we really put ourselves at the service of heritage, actually, of this monument.
So you always work with historians?
Yes. Oh, yes. Absolutely. With historians who specialize in the field of architecture and historic monuments. So they're real partners, and we talk a lot beforehand. So I tell them what I've seen, what I understand, what inspires me too, and what we're going to do or what we're being asked to do. And that helps them know where to look, and how to present things. And they teach us an incredible amount. They help us read the monument differently through the archives and the documentation, and to understand what the eye doesn't always catch.
So, would you have a story to share with us? Maybe more about the physical aspects, so people can picture it.
Well, there are many, but the one that comes to mind is the Collegiate Church in Braine, in the Aisne department, which I had the pleasure of handling a part of the restoration for a few years ago. Not that long ago, 2 years ago, and it was a really lovely project, which took place at the start of COVID. So, during the lockdown, actually, it was one of the first work sites to reopen after the shutdown in March 2020, and it was pure joy. It already felt kind of, just a little bit like a resurrection, or rather a rebirth, at least, for everyone to be back together on the site. So, It's a good example. It's a collegiate church, so a place of great importance, built of stone, roofed in slate, dating from the late 11th and late 12th centuries. Its restoration involves the roofs, the timber frames, and the facades. There's massive scaffolding all around, so you can walk around from top to bottom. Take it all in. So the first step was getting to know the monument, the gargoyles, the sculptures. We examined everything, cleaned it, and decided what we were going to keep. Of course, we keep almost everything, but in some cases, when a gargoyle or a carved element has disappeared, there's a question to answer. Well, we have to decide whether to leave the gap. Sometimes we leave it, but sometimes we replace it. So how do we replace it? And it was fascinating work. We worked with our roofers, our carpenters, and craftsmen who cut the slates right there on site, who are so fast and so precise, and the stone cutters and the sculptors, it's incredible, really. Well, I really love the way they can shape it as if it were clay. That stone is so hard. Honestly, it's truly impressive. I felt like we were all part of a shared work of art, kind of like a musical piece, in a way. Well, it's true, there's a lot of noise on a work site. Not unpleasant noise, but the sound of, the chisel carving the stone, slate being cut, the wood creaking, and it's just fantastic. Sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of a conductor for all this, and it's nice.
Well, it really nourishes you. In your opinion, what are the main challenges in heritage restoration?
The degree of restitution is one of the main challenges in heritage restoration. Personally, I feel that the main thing is to preserve authenticity. Like I was saying earlier, I think it's really important to understand what absolutely needs to be kept and showcased. Then the question often comes up in different ways. For example, when restoring a roof, whether it's slate, lead, or tile on a building, be it a castle, a mansion, or a church. Well, if the building is old, dating, for example, from the 12th century or the 16th, it's at least the 3rd, 4th, 5th, sometimes even 8th generation of roofing. So the idea of authenticity is somewhat relative in these cases, since the materials are completely replaced. So through documentation, observation, and analogy, and especially by looking at the archives, the documentation, for example, the very rich hours of the Duke of Berry, or lithographs, or architectural treatises. Let us see how were roofs and coverings depicted back then. So that gives us information that sometimes lets us recreate things that disappeared 2 centuries ago, but are missing today on a monument.
Do you ever have to manage construction projects on occupied site?
Yeah, that happens to me pretty often, especially with projects for institutional or administrative sites. So that happened when I was working at the Senate. So there are about 2,000 to 3,000 people working there all the time, which makes it a bit complicated. Chambord will also be the Grand Chancellery of the Legion of Honor, and finally a number of sites like that, which are still in use. So it's a bit of a juggling act, but it's planned ahead of time in coordination with the occupants and the project owner to basically, organize how the worksite will run. We coordinate to cause as little disruption as possible. So we tackle one section at a time. Sometimes certain people have to move out temporarily. We try to avoid it, but it does happen sometimes. Sometimes it can even be fun, but we still do it.
We know that a lot of heritage is destroyed due to lack of resources. You mentioned it a little earlier. I can't remember if that was off the record or at the start of our conversation. In your opinion, how can we make heritage architecture come alive? How can we minimize losses as much as possible? Maybe you have an idea about that?
Well, we've still got the key factor here. which is funding and subsidies. So I think we really need to keep funding at a sufficiently high level from the backers and from the state, of course. Even though it's obviously difficult right now, but it's important, especially for monuments that belong to local governments and to the state, which is the case for all churches, for example. So we need to be able to provide financial support. After that, I think obviously it's about maintenance, regular maintenance of monuments, helps prevent them from falling into ruin and keeps them preserved, these dear monuments. And then, you have to be observant. There are plenty of solutions. I think you have to love monuments. You need to raise the alarm when there's a problem. You have to speak up. But we're living in a great time for that with social media. Really, well, it's actually pretty great. Love for heritage has become trendy these days. Well, anyway, yes.
Brought together, yeah. The key player got together, that's it. The key players, yeah.
And so, well, people really like it. It's become popular.
So anyway, Stéphane Bern.
We can only be grateful to him for the work he's been doing forever anyway. But especially since the Bern Mission and the Heritage Lottery, which have done a huge amount to put heritage in the spotlight, even more than before. And in particular, to provide financial support, well, it's exceptional.
Maybe you have a point of view you'd like to share on that, preserving churches. Yes.
Oh, well, in this case, deconsecration, I'm not really seeing it. Well, what I notice is that it's a monument. For them to last longer over time, they need to be used. Well, it's true that churches aren't used as much as they used to be. That's just how it is. It's kind of the spirit of the times. But if they could be open more often, visited, made use of, even if you're not a believer, it's still the heritage of an entire nation. For example, Greek temples, Roman temples. No one worships Athena anymore, for example. Still, there are monuments that belong to a nation, so it's not exactly the same thing, but still it shares heritage. So maybe open them up a bit more? Yeah, take a closer look at their heritage DNA. Yeah, the church right in the middle of the village, It's a landmark. The steeple really brings people together too,
Do you ever run into roadblocks, sticking points, difficulties that make life a bit hard for you? Or is it more about the challenges of your job? How does that take shape? You always run into them anyway, in pretty much everything. So maybe you don't really feel like talking about it?
Well, we tend to remember the good times more than the bad ones. So I'm thinking about it, but maybe it's the frustration of not being able to do more. That's just a fact. Tied to the context. When you've got a castle that's in bad shape, for example, you have to make choices and spread the work out over time more than before. Well, the work, so we start with the most important things, then the rest. We'll get to the interiors a bit later, but it really all depends on the context. What's not going quite so well? It's mostly the deficit, but also the drop in subsidies. The regulations, yes, and that's perfectly normal. But restoration projects are a bit more complicated than they used to be, but it's for a good cause, the well-being of the people who work there. So you really can't be against that. But it can sometimes get a bit tricky when there's asbestos or lead. Obviously, that makes working conditions a lot more complicated in order to protect people. Well, working conditions are still tougher because you have to wear all that gear suits, masks, working conditions that are really, really complex and complicated. It's definitely not easy afterwards. That's for sure. Sometimes we run into, how should I put it, conflicting demands. These days, for example, it's necessary to bring historic monuments up to accessibility standards. When you're working for a client who's a museum, for example, or a place open to the public, they have to comply with the standards and make the upper floors accessible. So we look together at possible options, maybe installing elevators when we can. We can't always do it. Or maybe other systems. I don't have much beside the elevator.
As much toward the user as possible, but in the most delicate way too.
Yes, exactly.
Natural.
So yeah, when it comes to accessibility, it can be frustrating sometimes. We're a bit frustrated about not being able to do what we'd like or what we could. Anyway, we try, but it's an ongoing and very interesting dialogue with the state authorities and also with the labor inspection, you know. Everyone is really pulling together to do the best we can. And then, as you know, we all care deeply about preventing fires in historic monuments. That means bringing things up to code, modernizing, and it's not always easy to do that in an old building.
Yeah.
We do it.
Would you like to share what went through your mind when Notre-Dame was burning? Well,
oh man, actually, I had the chance and privilege to work for 3 years on Notre-Dame with Mouton, the previous chief architect of historic monuments, you know. So for 3 years, I pretty much had the keys to the cathedral in my pocket. So I knew her the way, you know, a dear friend or a family member. And seeing it burn was, like for so many people, a trauma that made me so sick I couldn't eat for a whole week. I mean, physically sick, actually. And then it's a nightmare. And then, on the other hand, then I was really right there. I mean, I was right at the foot of it, you know. But then also a huge relief when I saw, when I realized that the fire would probably stop. And luckily, that's what happened. And then I was carried along like everyone else, like all of us, you know, by that surge of energy. Carried, you know, by the president and all, and by General Georgelin. And General Georgelin, whom I knew, still I had redone the office at the Grande Chancellerie of the Legion of Honor, which I was really fond of. And Philippe Villeneuve and the DRAC, the inspection services, basically everyone who worked on Notre-Dame. We were so impressed.
Oh yeah? Quite something.
Yeah, in history, yeah, we went through that.
So then, if you had to define what it means to do architecture on a historic monument, today, in 2025?
Well, sometimes we actually do architecture. It's a historic monument, but not always, because often we restore the monument for what it is. After that, I think it's mostly about fitting in, or rather being part of a continuity, understanding which were or what was the original parts of the construction, basically, from the architects. And of all the teams that came before, well, we're just caretaker passing it on. So doing architecture today on a historic monument, I think it's about meeting those needs as well. It's about carrying it from one era to another, understanding it, and still giving it those new colors, which aren't always the same depending on the case, but it needs to have a new one. Anyway.
Yes. That comes through use?
Absolutely, yes. But using it really helps with proper recognition of the monument, you know, helps ensure its longevity. Yeah.
How do you see restoration evolving over the next 10 or 20 years? Whatever thoughts you have, you can share. Any prospects? Or maybe it's too soon, or you just can't?
I think I might see two things. The first is, and I've been noticing this for a few years now, it feels like it's a bit easier, more straightforward. And I think the tools we have today for restoration, whether it's for a project using drones, 3D scanning, or beam in some cases. Anyway, we really have tools now that make it easier to analyze a monument and define the project, whether it's in restoration, program planning, or creating contemporary work within the monument. So, I can see we're getting more and more precise, but be careful not to lose the soul, the sensitivity, and the intuition. And
it's going well for the convincing your client because you're now working with a project owner.
Yes.
So would you say things are generally going really well, or do the debates sometimes get pretty lively? You could say that...
Well, there are bound to be debates about historic monuments. Since the monument belongs to the nation, it has owners, and quite often they are private owners, but it's still heritage, so it belongs at the very least to future generations. So basically, what I'm saying is we're never alone when it comes to making a diagnosis, right? Like all architects, we follow the MOP law, often starting with an assessment, then applying for a work permit, and finally overseeing the construction. We get great support from the architects of the buildings of France, the curators of historic monuments, and also from the inspection. We have debates. We don't always agree, but we always manage to come to a conclusion for the good of the monument. Well, in any case, that's really the goal. We really feel like we're working as a team for a shared patient. You know what I mean?
Yeah, hand in hand.
Yes, exactly.
How is your team composed? We already mentioned that earlier.
Yes. So an in-house team of about 12 people. First, I work with my agency director, who's a heritage architect and also a project manager. So she's the one in charge of administration and development. Then there are architects, actually mostly heritage architects. Anyway, they specialize in restoring historic monuments. So there are 2 offices, one in Paris and one in the Loire Valley. People often work in pairs with project managers and also with people who are a bit more experienced. Junior staff, actually, the teams are mixed, meaning the pairs aren't always the same, so everyone can learn from each other, from another one and on other monuments. And besides, it's often the juniors who end up becoming project managers and key contacts, basically, who end up becoming their assistant while helping them out. So that's nice because it helps spread the training. And then I also work with construction economists and a lot of engineering firms covering structures, materials, restoration of painted surfaces and sculptures. That's something I hadn't mentioned. Sculptures. We have so many fascinating people here. It's really exciting. And surveyors too. Yeah.
So in the end, we've got skills that aren't disappearing.
Oh, no. That's why, to answer your earlier question, the future, personally, I see it as very, very promising because we have more and more young people who are getting into this kind of things. Oh yeah, whether it's on the business side, on the client side, or with the architects, and also, well, on the side of local governments. Actually, we have a lot of people who are aiming for that, and we're building less and less. Well, there are still a bit fewer opportunities to build.
So it's clear there's a shift back toward restoration and rehabilitation. Huge. And it's even becoming the norm. No, but that's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah. It's really in tune with the times. And you can see it in architecture schools too. My son just graduated. He kind of followed the same path, even though he's not going to be an architect restorer, but more contemporary. But I saw through him just how important rehabilitation projects are these days in architecture schools. And with professors who are really balanced in what they teach the students, actually. And, I see a lot of sensitivity.
Well, yeah, it's very promising in the sense that not so long ago, we used to ignore heritage and maybe destroy it much more easily.
Yeah, that's true.
Heritage that could have lasted a bit longer. Absolutely.
And especially the heritage from the 20th and 19th centuries, which up until maybe about 15 years ago, wasn't valued the same way it is today. As if those were periods in history not worth preserving. Yes, that's no longer the case today. And now, in this age of ecology and, well, a bit of economy too, but definitely ecology, and it's really not foolish to go in that direction.
Of course, in your work, you have a relationship with time that's ultimately quite elastic because you go very far back into the past and you have to project a lot into the future. So you have, I imagine, a depth of knowledge. From a historical perspective, we could almost do a podcast every week for a long time, I think. And it's actually frustrating for me not to have enough time. But there's a lot to say, yeah. And by the way, I'm really happy to welcome a female heritage architect without making it about minorities. So I'm really glad it's you who's here today. So you have this very elastic relationship with time. Well, you just gave a really optimistic message, and that's fantastic because I think it can bring back something that makes people want to get up in the morning, and we're still going through some rather tough times. In this relationship with time, what would you like to say to people to help strengthen that light you bring?
The fact of working on the buildings that were built 800 years ago, and we do everything we can to make sure they're still standing 500 years from now. It helps put things into perspective, and it also helps you take a step back. We're a bit off to the side in other words, we throw ourselves into it even more because the demands are huge. Because it's a monument that belongs to the heritage of all French people, you know. It belongs to the future, to the past, and to the future again. And at the same time, I'm not sure if that's a kind of humility. You don't even think about it when you're working on monuments. In the end, I feel like there's no room for ego, for example, when it comes to a monument. Well, in restoring a monument, you're mainly there to step back and let the work speak for itself, so that we're forgotten, so people don't say, oh, hey, it was so-and-so who restored it in such and such year. It's more like it was restored during a certain period when restorations were done like this or like that. That's what they wanted to do.
At the same time, there was the Louvre Pyramid.
Is that right?
I was just teasing a bit there.
Yeah, maybe it was, maybe not really. Yeah, well, it was heavily criticized.
And then in the end, everyone got used to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So this ties back to time, like you were saying earlier. It's true. We get used to things, we get used to certain things too. And it's true that the Louvre Pyramid, at least because of its, that new entrance, it was new back then, which will bring more changes. Well, things are going to change again at the Louvre, but in any case, that made it possible to organize the visitor route in a completely different way. That was really a very, very good thing. And as for the shape of that pyramid, in the end, everyone's gotten used to it. Now,
it's even very beautiful from certain angles.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. But indeed, at the time, not everyone liked it. I don't really remember it. I think I was still a bit of a kid back then. But I do know that often, in fact, we tend to remember the good times more than the bad. And I think we've kind of forgotten all that.
Is that right?
Yeah. So then, in some cases, when contemporary projects come along a few years later, they still don't go over well. There's always a chance to go back. And I realize now that what I wanted to tell you earlier was that more and more these days, the idea of reversibility is central to the choices we make. It's getting rarer and rarer to make major alterations to a historic monument as part of a contemporary project, except maybe to remove a very recent feature that really doesn't fit in at all with the rest. And even then, it all has to be approved. But I think we don't pour concrete anymore these days. We don't ruin things anymore, at least not as much, not with me.
All the better.
Oh, yes, all the better.
Yeah, because sometimes we've had those oh man moments all tied up in knots.
Of course. No, we're much more respectful of heritage today than we used to be. But times have changed. There were all those periods between the wars, after the war, and so many other things that meant people didn't see things the way we do today. These days, we take care of our heritage, and authenticity matters.
And we're also moving away. I think you can contradict me. I think we're really moving away from a very historical view of architectural practice.
Yeah.
With all those treatises that maybe really set architecture in stone. Whereas today we realize that the world is changing so much and so fast. We know there's permanence, but also constant change.
Yeah, that's true.
To define it, maybe I'd put it like this.
Absolutely. I think historic monuments are a great example of that.
Yeah.
They're timeless buildings that still need to be looked after, and they carry a lot of meaning, whether through their uses or their magic. In any case, the images they carry and bring people together around spark the imagination. Exactly. That's what they convey.
How? Imagine the world of tomorrow.
Which, well, I don't know.
However you want to take the question, whether in relation to your practice or to the heritage urban territorial space.
Well, I still feel there's an ecological awareness. It's starting to, well, it's not new at all, but it's starting to reach, them, in all our young people and even the not so young. I mean, I feel like we're heading that way toward an ecological awareness more and more important and present. I also feel that still it doesn't have a direct link to the environment or architecture. But I get the feeling that the world of tomorrow might see many people moving toward disconnection. Actually, I feel like for me, I sense we're heading toward a kind of a saturation from overconnection, really. Overconnection and going back to nature, going back to calm, to silence, to the sea, to the mountains.
Finally, to real things, to reality. Yeah. Which
things that relate to eternity, or at least to the passage from one era to another. I think we really need to disconnect, to reconnect with the earth. Well, I feel it very, very strongly. I feel like it's a need every human being has inside them, but one that's sometimes hard to bring out in everyday life.
Yeah. Especially when we have a virtual world that's completely hypnotizing. We get hypnotized by this virtual world. In a way, yes, and it's a kind of tug of war that's hard to handle. Yeah, and maybe even more so for kids, because...
Oh yeah, constant stimulation that in the end kind of hides things. Well, in the end, it kind of puts a lid on it, an energy we don't tap into enough. What a waste of time, huh?
Yeah, in everyday life.
What a waste of time on social media. But it's not just that. Anyway, we're all in high demand, really, really in high demand. And especially the young people, I notice.
Sometimes even feeling attacked without wanting to fall into the trap. Well, but it's not exactly a heavy moment.
Yeah, that's right. But I think I'm always really, really reassured, when I see my daughter. She's 15, she's a teenager, she's right in the thick of it, and I always feel really reassured to see that young people and teens in the end need, want, and look for those moments of pure contentment with something else, with things that feel a bit more real,
Nice.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to architecture students today?
What advice could I give them? To chart their own course. I don't know, there are plenty of pieces of advice to give, artist ideas, but maybe not locking yourself into one path too early or too quickly and staying free. Just because it can be tough sometimes when you're starting out after school to land that first job. Well, sometimes it's hard. Just because you were lucky enough to land your first job, your first gig, your first agency, doesn't mean you have to stay there just because you're lucky. No, I think that I feel like maybe that's just how I feel. It would be better to multiply good experiences that nourish you and help you grow, and that then help you find your path, rather than being afraid and ending up afraid.
No, it's not that nobody's afraid, but it's about shutting yourself in a little because of it. If it's out of fear, yes.
Out of fear of the future, of instability, and so on. But someone once told me, it was actually a person who had their own practice, a recruitment agency. That person told me, sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any. And that line really pushed me to take action every time I felt a little scared. I told myself, no, you shouldn't take too many risks. Well, yes, actually, we're always moving forward. And someone else once told me, well, you can't move forward if you've got one foot stuck in a bucket of cement. Basically, you have to keep walking, keep moving forward. And that's what I'd like to say to the architecture students, right?
Yeah, to future architects from all schools.
There are so many things to say. And things are changing so fast that, yeah, you really have to stay open.
Yeah. That'll be the final word.
But that's good. That's good. Great.
Thank you so much, Maël, for sharing your story. Dear listeners, thank you for listening. Join us next week for a new episode. Until then, take care of yourselves. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to tune in to our previous content on Instagram at Comme d'Archi Podcast. If you like it, make sure to promote the podcast by giving it 5 stars on Apple Podcast and adding a comment, or on any of your favorite podcast platforms. And don't forget to subscribe and listen to all of our episodes for free. See you soon, and until then, take care of yourself.